Let's begin.
Oh, hey there, scary story fanatics. Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. Are you hungry? Down to grab a slice? Well, better to grab a slice than be sliced, as I always say. But if you want a topping for that pie that you might not expect, settle down with your favorite snack. Be careful not to spill your drink or your blood. I call this one Two Friends at Freddy's.
The pizza party. Whether it be Super Bowl Sunday or some kind of family get-together, this delicious food is consumed by millions worldwide, most of them enjoying the feelings that such comfort food brings. But just because a party is in fact a pizza party does not necessarily ensure enjoyment by each party-goer. For instance, one could be allergic, or one may simply have had a bad experience. Others still may find the context in which the cuisine is provided to be less than adequate. And such is the case of two friends who bit off more than they could chew down there at that old Freddy Fazbear's pizza place. Scott lazily prepared himself for an eventful day, entering into any progression ending in its outcome with much reluctance. "Scott, honey, are you about ready?" Mrs. Irwin's voice carried through his shut bedroom door from downstairs. Yeah, Mom. I'm almost ready. Just give me a minute, geez." Scott stammered back at his mom, yelling through the same obstructions as opposed to opening the door. Scott was 14, starting today, and his mother had something special planned for his 14th birthday. Well, special according to her, dreadful according to Scott. She kept claiming it to be a surprise and wouldn't tell him where they were going, but he already knew. No matter how much he tried to tell her that he didn't want a stupid birthday party, and that he already knew what she was planning, and that there was no reason to lie about it, she remained firm and kept saying, "You'll just have to wait and see." Dressed and ready to go long before he left his bedroom, Scott left the confines of it to hesitantly greet his mother downstairs. Mrs. Irwin was all set to go by the time Scott finally caved and acquiesced to her requests. So, without wasting any time at all, mother and son climbed into their respective seats inside the minivan out front and shut their doors, buckling themselves in. Scott's mother, Mrs. Irwin, backed out of the driveway and headed off in the exact direction that Scott anticipated. But as the duo passed this assumed place, believed to be their destination, Scott spoke his first words since they began their trek. "Mom, you just passed by Chuck E. Cheese," Scott informed his mother. "Yeah, I know," was all she said in response. "But aren't we going—" "I told you, you just never know," she cut him off. Scott conceded to allow his mother to just drive. She obviously wasn't going to let on, and he sure as hell had no idea where she was going now. For the first time in years, Scott finally began to get his hopes up about his birthday. His heart sank into his stomach with a thud, all that much harder as the result of its previously lofty position, when she made her turn into the parking lot. A parking lot, if its appointed building had been any bigger, resembled that of a plaza car park. The building itself, a stone gray, capped off with an almost tealish green roof and awning. Yellow cement bumpers lined the front entranceway, lining and underscoring the white sign above, presenting 3 words in red italicized letters. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Oh, no, Mom, really? You can't be serious. This is even worse. Scott scoffed at his mother as she attempted to back her car into its space out front. I know, but Chuck E. Cheese was all booked up. This was all I could manage. Come on, I bet that once you get in there, you're going to end up having a great time, Mrs. Irwin assured her son. He would have done anything to have not gotten out of that car. Once the rest of the kids caught wind of this, he was sure to never live it down. But on the other hand, he knew he wouldn't get too far by being obstinate and remaining in the vehicle. His mom had a real knack for nagging, a kind of relentless badgering that almost anything else was preferable to. Fine, Scott sneered, unfastening his seatbelt. He slumped downward and mumbled things under his breath. Scott followed his mom in and through the doors of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. First, there was an admission booth of sorts. A young woman, seemingly in her 20s and clearly feigning enthusiasm, hung around behind the podium, just waiting for her chance to say, "Welcome to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza." Mrs. Irwin promptly informed the girl that they had a birthday reservation. Oh, God, Scott thought to himself in misery. How old is our little birthday boy? She asked, looking around. I'm 14, Scott answered, catching her off guard. The girl stood speechless for a moment, unsure of what to say before responding with, okay. Well, right this way, little buddy. The little girl led them past a few tables and a small arcade section, and into the main stage room. Freddy Fazbear, Chica, and Bonnie displayed proudly on the stage. A small token box, placed in the center up front, was there for those who wished to watch the trio sing and dance in exchange for the drop of a few tokens. 2 large tables were pushed together in the center, a few boxes of pizza placed evenly across them, congruent spacing between them. Each pizza had different toppings, and just about any kind of soda was available for drinking. But Scott ignored all these things. Once he had noticed his best friend Paul eyeing the machines on stage, effort giving attention to any other detail was tossed aside. Hey man, I can't believe my mom actually talked you into coming to this dump. Scott got his friend's attention, a grin from ear to ear.
Dude, hey, happy birthday! Aw, you look so big for such a little birthday boy.
Paulie teased him. Dude, seriously? Was Scott's retort.
Oh, come on, man, I had to.
Paul pressed.
Hey, at least your mom had your party at a different place this year. Chuck E. Cheese was starting to get real lame.
Paul said. Ha, dude, this place is even more lame. At least Chuck E. Cheese is the real deal, not some cheap knockoff, Scott replied.
Says you. This place always gave me the creeps, even before the release of those games. And you know me and horror shit.
Paul explained himself. Do you know how many times I've been here? How many people do you know that have been to this place? Out of those people, Paul, how many of those people have died? Scott finished his line of reasoning. Paul thought about it for a moment before giving the Inquisition a shrug and asking his friend to join him for some pizza and refreshment, and tossing the notion of an answer aside completely. That is, until later on, as the day progressed into evening. The group had their fill of pizza, cake, soda, and token-draining arcade machines before Paul resurrected Scott's earlier inquiry. The sounds of arcade sirens, clanking tokens, and the 4 other remaining party guests overwhelmed the senses so much that Paul had to lean in real close so as to finally relinquish what he thought to be his witty, well-plotted response.
You asked me how many of those people died?
Paul said in his ear, somewhere between a whisper and a shout, so as to overcome the relentless noise while negating the attention of any would-be eavesdroppers. What? What are you talking about? Who died? Scott asked him, completely forgetting about a seemingly pointless conversation that took place a few hours beforehand.
You asked me how many people I knew who had come here and died.
Paul reiterated. Yeah, so? Scott responded, failing to see his point.
Well, how many of those people have spent the night here?
Paul prodded his friend's cognition. What the hell are you getting at, man? Scott asked, still in a state of disequilibrium.
Ever seen Home Alone 2?
Paul inquired, a smirk forming on his face. Yeah, so? What's your point? Scott asked him to elaborate, but as Paul began to divulge the details of his brilliantly stupid scheme, Scott had already started to understand what it was he had in mind through the devices of Paul's analogy. Scott had assumed correctly. Paul elaborated upon the events of the latter half of the movie he had referenced when the two iconic Sticky Bandits, formerly known as the Wet Bandits, attempted to hide out inside of Duncan's toy chest until after hours, leaving them alone in the store to do as they pleased. And this is exactly what Paul had in mind for him and Scott. But, dude, isn't there a night guard? Scott reminded him.
Dude, there hasn't been a guard here in years. Not since the last guy quit or got fired or something. Come on, man. Don't be such a pansy ass.
Paul encouraged his perspective with a bit of taunting. Scott did not concede to the arrangement at first, not until Paul had laid out the arrangements that would facilitate their objective. It was simple, yet ingenious. Paul would ask his mom if he could spend the night at Scott's, and Scott would reciprocate by asking his mother if he could sleep over at Paul's house. Because the party was intended to be a surprise, Scott's mother parked out front while Paul's parents pulled around the side. With their intentions now set into motion, all that was left was to find a place to hide and hope the two did not confer too much with one another. While the rest of the group was playing in the arcade and the parents' supervision momentarily on the majority of the teens, Paul and Scott hastily and elusively snuck up onto the stage, behind the animatronic robots and behind the purple curtain, all adorned with numerous golden stars of varied sizes. Paul ducked in first, and then Scott behind him, carefully and stealthily closing the curtain nearly shut behind them, leaving only a splinter of light in which to see through. "Huh!" Scott yelled, as he backed into something both solid and soft behind him, and turning to only faintly see 2 rows of jagged teeth hovering motionlessly in the dark that surrounded them. Paul hushed his friend in fear of being discovered. As Paul bent over and peeked out behind the slit opening in the curtain, Scott turned to examine what had given him a startle, his eyes slowly adjusting to the black. A reddish costume-like fur fitted over something unyielding beneath. The majority of the thing was its body, which was somewhat human-shaped, but the head was that of a fox. Its one eye was large and googly-like, while the other was kept hidden by a black pirate-like eye patch. Before he had even examined the pointy ears or snout containing the rows of those sharp teeth, Scott recognized what it was. Foxy? "Hey, Paul, it's Foxy!" Scott whispered excitedly to Paul, having never seen this particular animatronic at the establishment before. Paul turned to see Scott pointing at the shape in the dark. Paul leaned in for his own inspection and paused for a moment before uttering out,
Whoa! Dude, I thought this guy was only made up for the games. I don't remember seeing him here at all.
Paul supported Scott's reasoning. Scott's gaze crept the length of Foxy's arm, ending where his hand/paw should have been. Seriously? Paul, look, he even has a hook for a hand. Scott stammered in disbelief. Time ticked by. The two sat in near utter silence, with their new furry companion, and wait for the party to end, and the crew to lock up for the night. Once, Scott spotted his mother conversing with Paul's parents and thought for sure that they were done for, but somehow their little plan was never revealed, aided by ambiguity and double meanings. Shortly after, the partygoers all filed out, leaving only the staff remaining inside. They swept and mopped and wiped where they needed, and the thought of them cleaning their hiding place did come to mind, but the thick layer of dust that coated everything assured them that the space had not been cleaned for quite some time, and the likelihood that this was the night it would in fact be serviced stood unlikely. The confined space even had a stale, disgusting smell to it, like someone had tossed a full pizza in there, and the cleaning staff members had never found it, leaving the cheeses and meat toppings to fester and rot. But soon they would reach their olfactory satiety and forget about the rancid odor altogether, leaving them with little else to discuss. Everything seemed to slow down. Minutes ticked by like hours, and if it wasn't for the occasional employee stopping by to clean something else in the main room in front of the stage, Scott would have passed out from boredom. Their hearts went into a flutter, and their minds jump-started to awareness with excitement when the lights suddenly turned off, and Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was left in a black, still silence. Paul and Scott waited a few extra minutes behind the plush, hanging curtain so as to ensure that the coast was indeed clear. Once satisfied with their isolation, the two crept slowly from concealment. Now that they could get a closer look without the interruption of employees telling them to get down off the stage, Scott and Paul first examined the three robots on the stage before them, each one of them their backs turned to them, facing out into an empty, non-existent crowd. Each looked as if brand new, seemingly well preserved, much like Foxy. Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica were covered in a plush, synthetic fur. Chica's more like feathers, the rigid sensation of steel and mechanical devices beneath. The place did seem much creepier in the dark, as Scott was struggling to admit. The ambient light of the exit signs and display lights softly caressed the walls, decorations, posters, and animatronics in a way that emphasized their oversized eyes, underscored rows of teeth, and painted the walls in cascades of dim red and blue hues. So what now? Scott asked his friend, unsure of what they should do with themselves.
Let's go see if the arcade machines are still on. I still have a few tokens in my pocket that I'll probably never get another chance to use,
Paul told him. Scott knew it was a long shot, but it was only around the corner, and they had nothing else much to do anyway. Paul was busy cracking jokes and talking with his friend, and Scott had been occupied doing the same. But when Scott eyed the pictures on the wall as they walked past, Paul seemed not to notice, only going on with whatever nonsense he was talking about at the time. Kids' drawings. The pictures seemed to have all been drawn by children, most of which portrayed a stick figure befriending an iconic animatronic or two, all of them cheerful and light. Scott gave a small smile to himself, remembering the magic of his own childhood. He thought to himself how his mother was pretty great in reality, and for the first time that day, Scott felt a slight sense of appreciation for what she had tried to do. Paul's words once again began to fall silent upon Scott's ears as Paul turned the corner, grasping Scott's attention back to his immediate surroundings. Some of the display lights were on in this room as well, but in the soft lighting, it was clear to see none of the arcade machines were on. Paul made sure to check the outlets, solidifying that the machines were in fact still plugged in, turned off as a direct result of the cut in power.
Shoot,
Paul exclaimed. Come on, man. Let's go back to the stage. I want to see if there's anything under those things' masks. maybe we can grab something as a souvenir. Scott enticed his friend. With that notion, Paul instantly agreed, and the two of them began backtracking towards where they had previously emerged. Once more, Paul continued his rant, and once more, Scott's attention shifted to that of the walls they passed. The pictures were all still there, hung in their tilts and angles exactly as they had been before, but they were different. One of them was a portrait-style drawing of Chica, seemingly done by a child. Its mouth was wide open, like stuck in a screen, its eyes gouged out and hanging from their hollow sockets. Another picture depicted a happily waving Freddy Fazbear, only Freddy was waving with someone else's hand still attached to a severed arm, highlighted by the spots of red crayon that were clearly intended to portray dripping blood. Paul? Hey, Paul, dude, fucking look! Scott yelled at his friend with panic in his voice. Paul stopped and turned to see his friend pointing at the wall behind him. Paul spun around and looked up and across the wall, scanning the pictures in their entirety before saying a word.
Yeah? So what? It's just some pictures. Off-putting, I'll agree, but what do you expect with a reputation like the one this place has?
Paul responded in explanation. No, you don't understand. They're different now. Like, they weren't like this before. Scott tried to tell him, but Paul just kept simply shrugging it off, blaming the discrepancy on an overactive imagination or tricks like that shadows play. But Scott knew what he saw, and Paul soon would take him at his word. Turning the corner into the party area, the contrasts of difference were immediately apparent. Papers, straw wrappers, and other refuse that had not been there before was scattered about the floor and tables. On the far wall, next to the other door that led out of this area, were giant letters that seemed to be engraved into the wall with a giant chisel or claw, spelling out the words, "It's me." Both Paul and Scott noticed each of these things instantly, but failed to comment on any of them once their gaze met the darkened stage on which resided two animatronic robots, Bonnie and Chica. No way. No fucking way. What the fuck's going on? This has to be some kind of fucking joke, right? Where the fuck is Freddy? Scott implored his friend, a begging plea for an answer in the tone of his voice.
I don't know what the hell's going on, but there has to be some kind of rational explanation for this.
Paul finally spoke. A rational explanation? I thought you said you were a horror buff. That's what everyone says, and then they fucking die. Scott's trepidation increased tenfold with each passing moment.
Dude, calm down. Let me just...
Paul's words fell silent when his ears caught notice of some disturbing, distant laughing, augmented and distorted through some kind of speaker or PA system.
No fucking way. No fucking way. You gotta be kidding me.
Paul said, fear now easily detectable in his tone. The two listened intently to the silence of the building, a missing animatronic, and terrifyingly creative imaginations scared the two into paralysis. Instead of fading, their anxiety increased with the sounds of approaching, clanging footsteps and the increasing sounds of more ominous laughter. What are we gonna do? Scott asked Paul, finding himself beyond the capacity of rational thought.
For starters, if that thing's coming from that way, then I'm going this way.
Paul pointed to the other exit adjacent to "It's me" written on the wall. Scott nodded shakily in agreement and followed his friend through the nearly black maw of the gaping doorway, down the hall and into some sort of storage room, shutting the door behind them. Lock it, dude. Fucking lock it, Scott demanded to Paul.
I would, man, but there's no fucking lock.
Paul replied, their guts rising up into their throats. The two of them pressed the sides of their faces against the door, trying to listen for anything that may be sneaking up on them from the other side. I can't believe you talked me into this, Scott scolded Paul under his breath.
Talked into? Dude, I just wanted you to have some fun on your birthday.
Paul whispered back at him. Yeah, thanks for the good time, man. We'll have to do this again sometime. Scott stopped when Paul interrupted him.
Dude, what the hell is that?
Paul said, eyes locked onto something behind Scott. Paul walked a little closer to Scott as he turned around, both of them now inspecting the collapsed lump on the floor. At their feet, barely visible only due to its stark contrast with the blackness of the room, was what looked like another animatron. Its fur was yellow and aged, its long ears ratty and bent, one of them broken in half, the other piece seemingly torn from places where the fur covering met the orifices of eyes and the mouth was torn and tattered. The synthetic creature bore a striking resemblance to the blue Bonnie still standing upon the stage, only much more worn, tattered, faded, and discolored. Scott's words, although soft and nearly inaudible, rang true in Paul's ears. Springtrap? This can't be happening. That shit was only in the game. This shit can't be happening. Scott attempted to reason with himself over and over again, but to no avail.
Dude, just calm down. We'll figure...
Paul stopped mid-sentence when something caught both the eyes of him and Scott. Two almost pinpoint pricks of light began to shine from inside Springtrap's seemingly hollow sockets, the center of which slowly growing with light and ever extending outwards towards their borders. Paul said nothing. Without thinking, he simply turned, pulled on the door handle, and ran out into the hall, not taking any chances and attempting to leave the nightmare of the storage room behind. "Paul, wait! That thing's out there!" Scott yelled at his companion as he darted out after him. Once his sentence was complete, the two stopped where they stood and listened closely to the surrounding darkness. Nothing. No laughter, no clanging footsteps. There was nothing to be heard or detected. "I want to get out of here. I want to go home," Scott began to whine.
I agree, man. Come on, let's get the hell out of here. The door's this way.
Paul assured him, knowing there had to be a door in the back, and it was likely close to where they were now. The exit sign at the end of the hall pointed their way. Each hurried side by side to the metal door. Paul gripped the knob and attempted to give it a turn.
It's locked,
Paul said disappointedly. Scott reached around him and tried the knob for himself, sighing in desperation at the conclusion of Paul being right. The two looked at each other in dismay, a dark realization cast over them like a shadow of a darkening sky. They had only one viable option left: the front door at the other end of the building. Scott tried not to let his imagination get the best of him, telling himself it was all in his head, that none of it was actually happening. Paul tried to assist him in realizing his goal of ignorance. The grim reality that was befalling them was too engulfing to ignore. There were two paths in which to make it out the front of the building. One would lead them through the stage area, the other past its entranceway, which was the path they chose. But upon reaching the entranceway, Paul stopped and stared into the room, causing Scott to nearly bump into him. "What is it?" Scott asked him, turning his head towards the opening as well, his eyes almost magnetically pulled to the now empty stage.
They're all fucking gone.
Paul muttered quietly in disbelief. "Yeah, I see that, and that only reinforces the fact that we need to get the fuck out of here." Scott had to yank his friend by the arm in order to pull him from position, threatening to drag him towards the entrance if he had to. Paul and Scott shot around to discover a robotic monster emerge from the dark right behind them, looming over top of them. The duo screamed in unison and took off in the opposite direction towards the front door, evading the grasp of a feathery, yellow robotic claw by mere fractions of an inch, by only a small portion of a second. The two of them sprinted down the corridor, towards the main doors and salvation, screams escaping over their gaping lips and images racing through their minds. Was it the same one, or something older like the Springtrap thing in the back room? Scott rescanned the depiction in his mind over and over again, in the matter of only a few seconds. Its ratty feathers, the torn coverings, the slack and seemingly broken jaw, a dark slime leaking and oozing out from beneath the teeth, and those menacing, glowing, lifeless eyes, sockets crusted over in a substance that can only be described as dried, flaky pus. But it was the smell that was the worst, an overpowering rancid aroma of singed hair and rotten meat seeped past its jaw when it bellowed its terrifying screech. Their nightmare was almost over, only feet from the door now. Paul slammed into it, trying to push through it. Scott began to assist him when he began frantically shaking the door. Before they knew it, they were both banging on it, pounding on it, screaming for help, pleading for their freedom. It was no use. So what now? Scott asked his friend.
I got one idea left. Our last chance. Almost every place has some sort of hatch or something that leads to the roof.
Paul pointed to the ceiling above them.
I suggest we try to get up there through the acoustical ceiling and see if maybe we can find a way through the decking.
Paul finished. Scott knew it to be a long shot, but they were out of options, trapped inside this iconic hell with no other chance to abscond. Paul climbed atop Scott's shoulders, piggyback style, and moved the ceiling tile over to the right. Slowly, Paul stuck his head up into the rectangular space. Nothing but pitch blackness. Paul was unable to see anything.
Hey, I think I'm gonna need a flashlight or...
A large white fox head with red circles on its cheeks sprung forward on the ceiling wires and electrical baskets that seemed to be connected too, stopping Paul in the middle of his thoughts and causing him to practically jump off of Scott's shoulders, ending in them both crashing to the floor. Hurt and rubbing their heads, the fall and the pain was brushed aside when Paul helped Scott to his feet after standing himself and attempting to head down the other corridor and towards the men's bathroom. The robotic laughter is what first grasped their notice, and then the large, darkened shape camouflaged against the blackened, low-lit background. But with one slow, clanging step, the thing laughed again and lent itself to the soft lighting emanating from the adjacent arcade. It was Freddy, the same plush, maintained Freddy Fazbear that they had admired earlier on stage, but now he was decrepit, faded, and tattered like the others. Tears in his fur covering revealed small amounts of stuffing and moving mechanics beneath. His glowing eyes were that of pinpricks in the centers of large, dark, circular sockets, each dripping, bleeding a crimson red that stained his light beige snout. Scott stood stock still, his legs incapable of deciding what action to take. A strong tug on his right arm, and Scott fell to the floor inside a small room, the room on the right that they had been standing next to, the one Paul had ducked into, yanking Scott in behind him and slamming the door shut. With a click, Paul let out a sigh of relief. This door had a lock, which was now engaged and tested to ensure the protection it offered. This room had a small lamp that, upon investigation, did in fact work once turned on. The room was confining, only big enough for a small desk and a chair that took up the rest of the square footage that the two were not already occupying. A small personal fan sat upon its surface, all covered with various invoices, balance sheets, and payroll forms. Posters saying, "Welcome to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza," and more childish drawings lined most of the surface of the walls, each adorned with images of the menacing animatronic robots that now stalked them in the dark on the other side of that locked door. The opposite wall of the small room had a single door as well, and upon double-checking that one, it was also found to be locked. They were in the office, safe, but seemingly trapped. The door in which they had fled into began erupting with sound and shaking in movement, vibrating the door jamb. The two friends began to once again scream for help, and continued to do so until the banging stopped. Neither Paul nor Scott said a word. Each was much too occupied in scanning the outside hall with their ears, wondering if that monster had given up and gone away. An almost innocent tune began sounding out behind them, each note almost a twinkle, as whatever instrument that played it plucked at its resonance. Slowly, the two turned their heads to the back corner of the small office, eyes landing upon an item neither had noticed before. It was a small, crank-style music box, and as it played, its crank circled round and round, counting down to some unspeakable end. "Dude, was it about the games in the music box?" Scott asked his friend under his breath.
Music box? I don't know, man. Wait a minute. No.
Paul leapt from position in a frenzy to get to the small music box, and just before he could land a single finger on it, its crank stopped turning, and its tune abruptly ended.
No way. It can't be.
Paul said to himself, desperately winding the crank. But it wouldn't work. The crank would no longer spin, and the box refused to play its tune. Paul stood up, looked into Scott's eyes with a pleading stare. "What is it?" Scott asked him. Paul said nothing, only screamed as a slender, black and white figure, adorned with a white, smiling mask and similar in proportions to a large sock monkey, appeared right behind Paul, as if somehow passing through the closed door behind him, and wrapped its long black arms, forearms covered in white bands, around Paul's waist. Scott couldn't believe his eyes. Even with all he had witnessed that night, he could not believe his eyes. It just took him through the door. Like when it had clutched Paul, he had become incorporeal, able to pass through solid objects. Paul was gone. Scott was left all alone in a small office, a lurking menace just beyond its borders. Scott wanted to listen on through the door, but was apprehensive of getting too close, fearful of suffering the same fate. So, Scott waited in silence and indecisiveness. That is, until he heard the echoing, distant screams that he immediately recognized as Paul's. Scott was terrified beyond comprehension, but he knew that if he did in fact make it out of this alive, he would never be able to forgive himself for conceding to leaving his friend to die without the offer of his help. With a gulp and a deep breath, Scott unlocked the opposite door, opened it, and turned left down the hall. The screaming continued, leading Scott in the direction of the storage room with an increasing speed that amplified with each subsequent shriek. He would have bet money on running face to face into one of those demonic animatrons, sealing his fate and the fate of his friend. But to his surprise, Scott made it to the storage room door and to the source of the screaming, unobstructed. Slowly, he gave the door a gentle push, and it creaked open, revealing the horror of its happenings beyond its borders. Tearing, blood, a final whimpering cry, squishing, and the crack of bone. Paul was laid out upon the large wooden table. Pieces and chunks of different parts of his anatomy littered the floor. The blood was unreal, the room seemingly painted in it, now all lit up by a swinging overhead light. Beneath it, surrounding the table, were 4 animatronic robots, each decayed, unmaintained, and seemingly dysfunctional. Foxy was digging at something within Paul's skull as he plunged deep into one of his sockets, a Freddy Fazbear animatronic head in his other hand. Chica and Bonnie stood near Paul's feet, each of them methodically and clumsily pulling and tearing the internal organs that had begun to spill forth from Paul's gaping torso, still attached within by various connective tissues and membranes, requiring the pair to pull each of them free with a splattering snap. Scott couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything. It was more than his overstrained mind could take. That's when Freddy, leaking, tattered, and covered head to furry toe in blood splatter, looked up, glowing eyes glaring right back into Scott's with malicious intent.
Looks like Freddy's gonna have to give you a bear hug.
Scott turned with only one thought in mind. The walls were covered in scribbles. "It's me," written furiously over and over. A thick, viscous fluid seemed to drip and ooze from compression fractures in each and every wall. None of this mattered to Scott. In fact, he barely noticed it, paying it no mind as he scrambled back to the safety of the office and locking its doors. Without any hesitation at all, Scott flung himself inside and slammed the door closed behind him with the force of his back. He locked it, checked its security by shaking the knob while he closed his eyes in relief. He just had to wait it out until morning. Just had to stay locked in and protected in the small confines of the office. Hesitation, fear, dread, and more washed over Scott as he slowly reopened his eyes. It wasn't there a second ago. He would have noticed if it had been. Yet, nonetheless, there it was, slumped on the floor in a heap, like a motionless cadaver. It was Freddy Fazbear. Its eyes were black and lifeless. It made no gestures, movements, and still, Scott trembled in horror. Its fur newer, maintained, and slightly lighter than the more iconic Freddy, more golden than brown. No, please don't. The following morning, police cars, red and blue lights flashing, swarmed the small pizza place. Whatever pieces of Paul that were left were easily discovered in the back room, the gruesome scene that the opening manager discovered the following morning, prompting the call to the police. During the search, Mrs. Irwin had arrived to discover a scene that she did not expect. She had realized Scott's deception the following morning as well, and after much worry and anxiety, decided to return to the last place she had seen him. The lead detective stopped her short of entering the stockroom, having slipped in undetected, in all the confusion. They assured her that her son was not in there, and was still missing. He asked her to take a seat at one of the tables in front of the stage, so he could return to talk to her and ask her some questions, possibly finding a significant lead. While waiting, Mrs. Irwin's eyes scanned the room, pondering the whereabouts of her son. When she looked upon the stage, she failed to recognize the all-too-familiar eyes behind one of the animatronic masks. Scott opened his mouth to call to his mother, but when he did, he found himself capable of only muttering one simple yet cryptic phrase.
Hey there, little buddy.
We all have something special inside of all of us.
So, if there is a lesson to be learned here, it's to never overstay your welcome, because once the lights go out, anything can happen, up to and including murder by homicidal psychotic possessed robots. Who would have thought I wouldn't see that coming? But if you're brave enough to come back, remember to run like something's chasing you back here next weekend. And until then, remember to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can jump scare you all again next Saturday.